This is part 2 of making a cat dating app with ChatGPT. If you missed the first part, make sure to check that out first. To start with a spoiler, my experience has really been the same as Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, predicted in a tweet from March. GPT seems more impressive on first use than it does after you spend more time with it. But what are the flaws exactly? Well, let's have a look. In terms of scaffolding, right off the bat we got really good step-by-step instructions on how to install Expo and set up our project. However, when asking it a bit later to summarize our project, it did manage to remember the broad strokes, but forgot some of our screens and folder names. However, the UI styling GPT provided us with changed drastically for very similar prompts. In a previous try, it gave me a halfway decent looking login screen right away. In the prompt I used for the video, we ended up with something a lot more basic. By simply asking it to make things look more professional, it happily complied, and we got this sleek looking screen. Getting it to actually compile was quite a bit of work. GPT started out by telling us to install the React Native paper plugin, and put all the styling information nicely tucked away in a separate styles.js that it would easily figure out how to reference. But it had used code from the React navigation stack. Prompted with the error, it gave instructions to install the package. That didn't work. So it tracked back to use version 5 instead of 6, and then changed its mind again to use version 6. Which now worked because it now used the correct native stack package instead of stack, a mistake that's easily made for a large language model predicting input, I guess. Then asking it to apply the same style change to other screens worked much better again, even though it would forget to add packages from time to time. A somewhat trickier case was to get it to display the picture of the login user as the first in the grid. GPT mastered the showing part by correctly combining the user struct with the profiles list of the other users. The first blunder was to change methodology though. It no longer wanted to use the styles.js. It created and put our styles inline this time. And it had also forgotten to change the click handler. Well, either this or I didn't explicitly tell it to do that this time. After that prompt, it caught on and changed our onPress handler to include a isCurrentUser flag that it correctly created. Everyone who has ever worked with CSS will know that some things are harder than they look, and so GPT fell into a number of traps. I then tried being a little more specific, and even more specific, to which we got the proper styling, again inline, but hey. Asking it to make changes that only require changing a few values worked much better, such as here changing the border radius. Going to the boilerplate code GPT generated, it looked really solid and was certainly a time saver for small projects. Here we see the initial setup for our React Native app with 6 screens. Also, the login view is solid and could save a bit of time. The setup for our image grid is also interesting, however here we have the style inline, something that as we have seen changes around quite a bit. A major help was the SAM template, which was really good out of the box and featured correctly set up policies and references. Our API.js file looked decent too, even though we got no error handling this time. That is something GPT wasn't very consistent with either. Here we see an example where DynamoDB put is wrapped in a try-catch, and 500 and 200 responses are caught and simply return without any specific logging. And whenever GPT isn't too sure what an error might be caused by, it is generally helpful in trying to implement proper log statements. However, it's also mixed matching alert and console log statements, which depending on what you're trying to achieve may not be a particularly good idea. Similarly, catch blocks were a wild ride of inconsistency. Here we see an alert that swallows our exception, followed by one that isn't consistent within the same file. On the top we see a console log that includes our exception, and further down it's being swallowed again. Here we see a logical construct in case response message is empty, or something a little more elaborate when we get our HTTP method and URL worked into the string. And then again, sometimes we only get a suggestion about what to do. Another problem I encountered was GPT not being able to differentiate between variable names and the underlying concept of what it contains. In DynamoDB, token is a reserved name and can't be used as a field name, so I had it named pw_token, which turned out to confuse GPT time and time again. Here it is correctly guessing that there is a naming mismatch, but overlooking that in another screen we're using form data instead of JSON. Similarly, it kept confusing our table name, sometimes calling it simply users, and other times going with users table as one word. And finally, we see an example of it getting seriously confused with how to use a struct it is returning from another file, sometimes expecting response data success and other times just response success. At the beginning, I asked GPT in a different window about what I was trying to do. And what I didn't notice was that I was actually going over the limit. But no problem, GPT just completed what I had written anyway. So guess that's good. It was a bit scary, but yeah.